This is the last of a series, and I get to host with. My name's Herb Bailey, and I get to host with Mary this evening with Dr. Danny Carroll Rojas. Did I pronounce that right? I always mess that up. I did not. You got I need you to fix that because it for over a year I've been pronouncing it wrong. Anyway, Christine, well, help me pronounce it right first before I keep going.
It's a D, so it's Rodas.
Rodas. Okay. Um, thank you. Christine is in the air. I was just texting with her. She is on her way to Singapore, and so she will not be with us. But we're hoping that we're praying that she lands safely, and we get to have a conversation with her again soon. Hi, Mary. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Glad to be here, Herb. Hope
That's
everybody made it over with this new link. I'll be
yeah.
watching for anybody popping in late. Try and let them in.
Good. We are all about being flexible in the kingdom of heaven. If you're not flexible in the kingdom of heaven, you will be bent out of shape. So it's important to be flexible. All right. With that, I will open us in prayer if that's all right.
Yes,
And
please.
then we will jump into it. What do you think?
Great. Looking
All
forward
right.
to it. Thank you.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
Lord, thank you for giving us this opportunity, the technology, and more importantly, the understanding of who you are as we attempt to live lives that are honoring to what you have done for us in gratitude and in hope of an eternal time when we will hear, well done, my good and faithful servant. And pray all this in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, Dr. Danny.
Okay, I'm just looking for a piece of paper here. Okay. Well, this is the last time. And so for those of you who are still around, thank you for hanging on. I think we've been doing this for over a year. So I think this may be like the 15th or 16th time we've gotten together. And what I wanted to do tonight, because it is the last night, was to kind of give an overview, a review of what I would think are the most important things as takeaways for all the times we've been together. And so actually we have more time for questions tonight, perhaps, because of we're starting well. So instead of starting around 7:15 or 7:20, at least Central Time, it's like 7:05, so that's good. So let me do this. And again, there we go. Okay. So what I want to do, like I said, is do a review. And so there's the initial title, a review. So what I want us to do is actually go back to the beginning. And the goal of this series has not been necessarily to give you passages, because that's sometimes, I think, where people limit themselves. They're looking for some passages, and those become the go-to. But what I'm trying to do is actually give a bigger lens. So if we can appreciate that the Bible, the Old Testament in our case, is giving us a window into how to look at reality, and that would include how we understand God and how we understand the world and how we understand the place of the people of God in the world. If we can get that, then we're thinking more globally. We're not just thinking about some verses. We're actually getting a sense of what we're all about and what God is all about. And so we began many months ago just making some basic observations in Genesis, which to me are the basics for any kind of Old Testament social ethic. And there's some key terms that go back to Genesis chapter 1, where it says, God creates in the several days of creation. And he saw that it was good. Now, what's important to understand is in that passage of Genesis 1, the idea of good is that everything is in its place. He's located them there. It talks about dividing waters and land and putting different kinds of animals in different places. There is a natural order of things are where they're supposed to be. And the idea is that everything is functioning like it should be. Even the rhythm of the night and the day and the seasons and everything according to its kind. Everything is functioning well. And when God creates humanity, there it says that he saw that it was very good. Now, what you see then is that humans are the pinnacle of God's creation. All of God's creation is important, but there's something particular about a human being, because only humans are made in the image of God. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But as we look at the idea that everything is in its place and everything is functioning as it should, that is obviously, and the most basic, is a natural order of things. But this natural order of things, because it is how everything should function, also has this idea of a moral component. Everything is as it should be. And what we will see with the fall and the repercussions of the fall, everything is thrown out of kilter. It gets harder for humans to live within creation. Humans begin to destroy each other. The natural order, the natural fabric of our existence has been changed with the fall, but also the moral fiber of our existence is changed as well. And we'll be looking at that. So we have to realize that this is not the world as it should be, that we should expect the need for ethics, the need for social engagement, because of the very fact that things are not like they should be. The question then is, how does God respond to the world as it now is? The other thing, another key word in the passage is the word to bless. God blesses the creatures and tells them to multiply. He also blesses human beings and tells us to multiply. So this idea of blessing is about physical flourishing. It's about children and offspring. It's about things reproducing themselves. And this is part of the natural order of things as well. All of creation, whether you're talking about trees or insects or animals of any kind, all of us are involved in the creation of others like us. It keeps on going. This is part of the blessing of God, the continual giving of life in all of its forms. But when you get to chapter 2, verse 3, what God does there is he blesses the seventh day. And this is a day set aside for him, as we know from the scriptures. But now what we begin to see is that the blessing is not only about material things. It also has a spiritual component. So that the blessing of God covers all of our existence, our material needs and realities, as well as our spiritual dimension of relationship with him. It's going to be important as we move forward in these early chapters. And then the last thing that I want to mention about chapter 1 is that the image of God. I've already mentioned it, but if humans are made in the image of God, the question then is, who is in the image of God and what does it mean? In the ancient world, the ones who would be in the images of their gods would be the king. And so it's a royal prerogative. But when we get to Genesis chapter 1, all of humanity is made in the image of God. So in a sense, the image of God now is a democratic reality. All of us are made in the image of God. Now, here's the interesting thing. In the ancient world, the image of God was connected to royal persons, the king. But if you read the passage there in 26 to 28, humans, all humans, are made to rule and subdue the earth. In a sense, we all are royalty. We all have the right and the prerogative and the privilege of ruling, of subduing the earth. But what does that mean? Well, if we look at, this will become important as we move into the political arena in a little bit. If we look at Genesis 1 as the idea of the divine creator, who is also a divine sovereign, who's organizing everything and thereby ruling everything and putting everything in its place, by telling us to subdue the earth and to rule over it, he's inviting us to join with him in his ruling of the earth and of other creatures. So this is an incredible reality. It tells us that all humans are unique and have consummate value. It also tells us that all humans have this unique privilege and therefore a responsibility before God. But it also tells us, because we can rule, is that we have potential. So human worth is not just the fact that we have a lot of value, but the human worth is all the things that we can do if we rule under God. Now, this is important in this country, for instance, when we're talking about immigration. You see, when we talk about immigrants made in the image of God, it's not only that they're worth a lot as human beings innately, but also all the things that they can do, that they can bring to the life of the country itself. So this has to be the basics and the foundation for Old Testament ethics. Understanding God as ruler, a loving, gracious, sharing his sovereignty with his people. This is the kind of king that we serve and live under. He is the one who sets the parameters of existence. And of course, then what he'll do is he'll give the law, which also will set parameters for the existence of his people. But it also means that if all humans are created in the image of God and all humans have all this worth and potential and privilege, that also will be important for ethics, because that will determine how we treat other human beings. And if what we see in ethics is the violation of other human beings, this triggers, of course, the need for ethics. But this is the framework. Divine King ruling over us ruling over other things in obedience and in responsibility to him. This is human existence. So that's the first thing that I wanted to review. As we all know, of course, things go desperately wrong very early on. So this is what I'm calling the human predicament. Because what we find in the garden is sin. And this is going to be all-encompassing. It will be all-pervasive. So how does that work in the biblical narrative? Well, if we go to Genesis chapter 3, the temptation that the serpent launches against the man and the woman. I'm having my coffee, so please forgive me. That's my after-dinner drink. Okay, I'm good to go. The temptation begins with, has God really said? So he's testing how much they remember and how much they know. But then he says, God, what he's really worried about is that you will become like him. And this is the temptation that all human beings have, is to be like God. Now, what we'll have to ask ourselves is, how does that play itself out in our existence? Which it does. But if we had understood in Genesis 1 and 2 that we are made in the image of God, in one sense, we are already like God. We are in his image. We are like him. But this temptation is, in a sense, to become like God without God. To be like God, but putting God to one side and ruling the earth and ruling over ourselves as we would want to be, and no longer under the sovereignty of God. Now, the thing that is so tragic is chapter 2 and how it plays itself out. In chapter 2, what we have is that God, it says in chapter 2 early on, that he molds and he shapes humans and he breathes life into them. And he gives human beings the idea or the challenge to till the earth, to labor, to work. This, again, is part of what it means to be human, is that we work. But again, always under God. But you're in a garden with infinite provision and his very presence with us. But there's also a warning, and this will be what we have to link 3:5 with what we find in 2:17. Because what he says is this: you can eat anything in the garden except for the fruit of this one tree that's in the middle of the garden. And then he says, on the day you eat from that tree, and the Hebrew is very emphatic, you will surely die. And in the Hebrew, it's dying, you will die. It's a very emphatic kind of construction. So we have these two things. What does death mean? Because there is no death at this point. And how will human beings act out being like God? Now, as we work our way through Genesis, we have all kinds of interesting things that we see. Even in chapter 3, when they eat of the tree that's in the middle of the garden, they do not die. That's what we had expected. The only thing that dies is an animal, because God will clothe the humans. But what we find is once they have sinned, not only do they not die, we'll get to that in just a moment, but now there's shame. Now there's blaming one another. And now we begin to see that this harmony between God and human beings and between the man and the woman is broken. At the end of chapter 2, when God brings the woman to the man, and the imagery is like a father bringing a bride to the bridegroom. That's the image there. All the joy and wonder that we see at the end of chapter 2 is broken now, and what has taken its place is mutual accusations. Okay. Now the tensions, even between the sexes, has begun. Now the tension between humans and the earth is beginning. And it's ironic because no one has died yet. And it's even more ironic because when the man gives the woman a name, he calls her Eve, which is connected to the Hebrew word for life. She is the mother of all the living. How does this work? And then in chapter 4, the very first verse is, she has a son, and she thanks God for helping her have a son. So I thought there was another thing there, but let me go back. So what you find in chapter 4, after the birth of the son, there's the birth of a second son. There's just life everywhere. What about the idea that if you eat from the tree of the garden, you will surely die? Well, Cain kills Abel, and death has come. Later, by human hands, it's fratricide. You're killing your own brother. And at the end of the chapter, Lamech is celebrating how many people he has wounded and how many people he can kill in his revenge. Humans will begin to see, and this is crucial for our understanding of ethics and the kind of ministries that people are involved in. Humans are inherently violent creatures. And the way we exhibit our violence is we kill one another. And this is from the very beginning. Not only is our connection to the created order disrupted in chapter 3, now humans are killing each other. And there is no spiritual death as you would find it kind of in New Testament language. But what we have is separation from God and no way back into the garden. So, in a sense, again, using New Testament language, but it's not Old Testament language, the idea of spiritual death. The Old Testament sees it as separation from God, no relationship with God. And then, even when he curses Cain, what Cain is afraid of, he says, don't send me wandering, because when they find me, they will kill me. It's this idea of violence in our existence, brothers killing brothers, um, uncontrolled vengeance with Lamech. This is human existence. And then you move into chapter 5, and you have this refrain, and he died, and he died, and he died, and everybody's dying. The only person who doesn't die is Enoch, and he's taken up into the heavens because he walks with God. But the point is, whereas in chapter 4, humans are dying violent deaths, in chapter 5, that's not mentioned, except for the idea that everybody's dying. So probably what we're looking at is just dying from old age and disease. Now, when you move into chapters 6 to 8, you get the flood and everybody dies. Even the creatures are dying. But the point that's crucial for ethics is this, is that we have to come to grips with the reality that we live in a world of death. There's death all around us of every kind, grounded in our violence, grounded in our separation from God, in our separation from one another, in our separation from the created order. We are dying. All of us are dying and killing one another. And this is why you need ethics. How does God respond to this kind of thing? Well, I'm still with glimpses of hope. You get Seth, and he begins to call out, and he's the first one to call on the name of the Lord in chapter 4, and Enoch is taken away, and at least one person seems to be doing okay. And then Noah is a righteous man, and even though chapter 6 will tell us in verse 11, the whole earth is full of violence, and there it is again, there is this one righteous man, Noah. And in chapter 5, verse 21, it says that he is called Noah, which is a wordplay on the Hebrew for rest, because he will comfort us from all the toil and the sweat from chapter 3. All the kind of hope we have with Noah. He builds the ark, he obeys, he gets through the flood, and all that sounds good. The waters subside, he comes out of the ark with his family, he offers an offering to God, all that is very good. But then he plants a vineyard. And our last glimpse of Noah, the great hope of the world, is lying passed out, drunk in his tent. So, the need for ethics, because we live in a world of darkness and death. The question is, what can we do? Even the most righteous man in the world is flawed, deeply flawed, and fails. It gets worse. So in chapter 10, after chapter 9, where Noah is drunk and passed out, what we have in chapter 10 is a whole list of nations. And these are organized, actually, because at the end of chapter 9, Noah will say a word to each of his 3 sons. And then in chapter 10, it will tell us what nations came from each of those sons. And what we're seeing is a list of the nations that would have been known at the time. But we ask ourselves a very simple question, because it's repeated several times in chapter 10, the idea that these are the nations according to their territories and according to their clans or families and according to their languages. But we get to chapter 11 and it says they only have one language. Well, how does that work? What we're seeing in the Bible, and this is not unique to this part of Scripture, What we're seeing is not a chronological order, but a theological order. Chapter 10 is kind of this large footnote about what families came from the three sons. But chapter 11, now you're back into the narrative, and it's going to tell us how that happened. How were the nations dispersed if they all began, from the one man, Noah? How did that work? Now, again, what we're going to do is step back and look carefully at the details. And this is going to be important as well for ethics. It says in chapter 11 that the people had moved east to the plain of Shinar, and they say, let us build a tower, let us build a city, lest we be scattered. Well, that was what they were told to do at the very beginning. But let's build a city so we won't be scattered, and let us build a tower that reaches to the heavens. And thereby we can make a name for ourselves. Now, in those words, building a city so that they will not be scattered, which is what they were supposed to do. Oftentimes in the ancient world, when you think of the word city in the ancient world, unlike modern times, the idea of a city in the ancient world usually had the connotation of a wall. It wasn't a village. The definition of a city was that a city would have a wall around it. Well, why would you have to have a wall? Well, for protection. So what you're hearing, they're aware of their own violence. Let us build a city. And then, so the violence is still there. A tower that reaches to the heavens. Now, with ancient discoveries, these towers would have been like a step, steps. It's called a ziggurat. And visually, the idea was there's a very famous song, and maybe Herb, you and I remember it because we're older. But Stairway to Heaven is what we're seeing is Stairway to Heaven, both coming and going. You see, so the idea is not only that might they reach the heavens, but God could come down to them. Again, they've totally misconstrued how things were supposed to work, and then they say, and let us make a name for ourselves. Now, what you see then is the arrogance. See, humans are immensely creative with all kinds of gifts. The fact they could build a city and a tower, it's amazing. But as a name for ourselves. And what God will do is that he will scatter them. Now, the important piece here, and we'll come back to this in the next slide a little bit, but I want to at least introduce it here, is that if we understand that chapter 11 explains how we got chapter 10, if chapter 11 tells us where all the nations of the world came from, what it tells us is all the nations of the world are born at Babel. So the arrogance of humanity isn't just in individuals wanting to play out being God. The arrogance of humanity now is social, it's national. And you see it all around us. I mean, throughout human history. Where a nation will think it's better than anybody else. So if you see a slogan, which we have, make America great again, what you're hearing is Babel. If you look at Russia in the invasion and how they portray themselves as this great, nostalgia for empire of what used to be the Soviet Union, or the rise of China. What you're seeing is human arrogance and ambition and power playing itself out in the leaders, but also as a national ethos. And you can look throughout human history in all the nations of the world, and this is what you see. This is what humans do. And we socialize ourselves into this. So every country in the world will have a national anthem. They'll have certain holidays that are geared to reinforce national pride. We'll have a flag. All these things are what humans do. Every country in the world in human history. But what you're seeing is national arrogance. Now, sometimes it can play itself out in innocuous ways, like the Olympics or something like that, where you're competing, but it's you're just cheering for the home team kind of thing, or the World Cup or something like that. But this national pride, even though it can be very fruitful and very helpful, it can also have a dark side to it because humans have a very dark side. And now that arrogance is social, political, it's military, it's economic. And this is how we understand human existence. But what you're seeing is the need for ethics. But the point of that is the ethics is not only individual, but now you begin to see the need for ethics at social and national levels as well. Let me stop for a minute here, Herb, and see if there's any questions that anyone might have. Are you going to monitor those, or is Mary?
Yeah, I forgot to say that. Mary, are you monitoring the questions? We have 17 people
Yep.
signed up. Okay, do we have any questions yet?
Please type it in the chat anytime, everybody. Yeah, I'm wondering, so you said that national pride can be helpful. What is the place for it? Like, is there a place for it? Does God does he want us to be proud of our culture or national identity, or is it purely bad?
Well, I think it can be good. I mean, so for instance, I'm half Guatemalan, and I fly to Guatemala this coming Saturday. So I'm looking forward to the food and the music and seeing my family and some of the cultural things that we do. Those are all good things. All kinds of cultural achievements and literature and music and architecture and all these things, oftentimes can only happen because of national structures, national financing, things like that. I mean, so it can be very good and very helpful, and it can reflect human dignity and all of human creativity. The problem, of course, is that it can have this dark side. So you conquer somebody, or what you do, when you look at this kind of national thing, what I should have said and added, so thanks for the question, Mary, is it also can be, for instance, racial. So what we'll do within a nation is that we will stratify in terms of worth different racial groups. Okay. And so one racial group will dominate another one. Okay. I mean, what you're seeing is Genesis 3 playing itself out racially. It can also play itself out economically, where people with economic power will crush and take advantage of those who do not. I mean, it's just humans are going to act this thing out in every dimension of our existence, politics, economics, social. You see it in the gender thing. I mean, where men can abuse, not only emotionally, but physically as well, because oftentimes men are just physically bigger. And so men will use this to their advantage, you see. So what you're seeing is men acting out Genesis 3 because they can't. I mean, so you'll see it in a playground with a bully. I mean, you don't even have to teach kids this. It just kind of comes naturally where people just do this to each other. And but I mean, for instance, ambition. I mean, the fact that all of us have ambition of some sort, I think is part of being made in the image of God, of wanting to be better and learn and grow. I think that's part of being in the image of God. But ambition can have its negative side too, because oftentimes as we act out our ambition, the way we achieve is by
Mm.
eliminating rivals. You see? So instead of empowering other people, what we do is we exercise our power over them.
Mhm, mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Great question.
Any other questions? If not, I'll just keep going.
I don't see any in the chat yet, but I'll keep watching for them. Yeah, if you'd
Okay.
like to
And
continue.
Thanks, Barry.
Just
Thank you.
stop me, okay? Because we're doing very well on time.
Great.
Okay, so if you read the first 11 chapters of Genesis, it's kind of depressing. The few shots at good things, whether it's Seth or Enoch or Noah, they're kind of just a short spark of light and then it's gone. And so you begin to ask yourself, okay, what's going to happen with humanity? And this is where we get the call of Abram. And you see the story of Abram begin at the very end of chapter 11. And words matter, and I'll show you this in just a moment. But what you find is this. Again, the logic of it's important because it has implications for ethics. When we go to the Old Testament, God does not choose a nation. He can't. All the nations are born at Babel. So every nation of the world is going to have that and as part of their DNA. So what God does is he chooses a man with the idea of creating a nation. This is why part of the promise to Abram is the idea of offspring. He will create a nation and in miraculous ways. I mean, so if you read the rest of Genesis, one of the challenges of the Genesis story is children, where you find barren women and old men and things like this. And so what you're finding is um, God's creating a people that will kind of blossom when you get to the book of Exodus. But it's not an easy process, and it's full of all kinds of obstacles and opposition as well as their own sin. But this is what God is in the business of doing, is creating a people. But we have to ask ourselves, creating a people for what? Now, what you begin to see is how the call of Abram and the promise to Abram in chapter 12, 1-3, is an echo as well of Genesis chapter 1. So when he says, I will make you into a great nation, there the idea is a numerous people. Well, that's an echo of Genesis chapter 1, when he says, be fruitful and multiply. And what we will find with the patriarchs is that he will begin to multiply the offspring of this people. So what you're finding is that the people who are descendants of Abraham are actually going to act out what God would have wanted for all humanity. And then he says, I will make your name great. Well, if you remember from Genesis chapter 11, verse 4, they had said, let us make a name for ourselves. But what God is saying is, I will make your name great. Not that you will make a name for yourselves, but I will give you a great name. And the way that the people of God will achieve a great name is not by their ambition or their achievements, but because of the hand of God and in their obedience. It is in their obedience to their call that their name will become great. You can see how God is just turning on its head what is natural for humanity is what he will call his people to do and to be. Now, the other thing that's crucial, he tells Abram, and in you or through you, all the families, now it depends on your English version, but the Hebrew word, depending on your translation, is translated as families, peoples, or clans. Okay. But if you had read Genesis 10 carefully, when it says, and these are the descendants of Noah, when you get to the end of the first son, It says, these are the descendants of X son, according to their families, territories, and languages. Verse 20, now you're at the second son. And then you get the summary verse. These are the families, these are the descendants of this son, according to their families, according to their languages, according to their territories. You get to verse 30, and you see the same thing again. These are the descendants of the third son, according to their clans and languages and territories. And then 31 is kind of repeating it as a summary. But here's the point. These are all the families of all the nations that are born at Babel. And when God says in chapter 12, in you and through you, all these families of the earth will be blessed, meaning all the nations which are born out of rebellion, all the nations which have in their DNA arrogance and violence, these are the ones that will be blessed by the people of God. Now, there's something else that's important to watch in this first few verses of chapter 12. The first thing is, what we see, is that God says, I will bless you, and I will bless you. And then he says at the end of verse 2, so be a blessing. Now, what you're seeing is a very important order. We are blessed to be a blessing. Okay? So the order is important. As we experience the blessing of God, we are now given the charge to be his instruments to bless the very nations that rebelled against him. Now, if you remember that blessing in Genesis 1 and 2 is material and spiritual, you'll also see this play itself out in the book of Genesis. They will have flocks. They will find water. They will have children. And the people they come in contact with will experience this as well. But what you also find them doing is building altars and proclaiming the name of the Lord. You also see them saying, this is what we're doing, and we are seeing the hand of God. And so you're seeing verbal proclamation and visual proclamation in the giving of the sacrifices. And there are several incidents in the book of Genesis where the non-Israelites will say, we see that you are blessed of God. So what you're seeing is, as they are blessed materially and spiritually, they're communicating these things, and the people around them are actually seeing it and verbalizing that they see it. But it also says this in verse 3. I will curse the one who curses you, and I will bless those who bless you. Now, you need to see this very carefully again. On the one hand, the idea is that the people of God should expect opposition. They should expect that they will be cursed. Now, in the Hebrew, it actually gets to a finer point. Because he says this, because there are actually two different words. In English, often English versions say, I will curse those who curse you. In the Hebrew, it's actually more precise. In the Hebrew, it says, those who count you as nothing. In Spanish, we have this verb, menospreciar. Those who think you of little value. Those who demean you. That's the idea. Okay? I will curse. Now, what's even more particular is that he doesn't even use the plural there, which I just did, which was wrong. Because the one who treats you as of no value, I will curse. The expectation is there will be opposition, but it's a minority. And those who bless you, I will bless. There's the plural. So the idea is, he puts the idea of people demeaning us as a singular, and the people blessing us as a plural. The expectation is if we are actually being a blessing, we should expect opposition. That's just part of what it means to be the people of God. But if we are actually being a blessing, those who will demean us will be less than those who bless us. And again, that blessing is both material and spiritual. There is no social ethic in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that does not go with the proclaiming of the name of God. We're not kind of anonymous do-gooders. We do this in the name of our God, and that is part of the blessing. The blessing is material. The blessing is also spiritual. Okay? So what does the blessing mean? We've already talked about this. But if we can understand that in Genesis 12, God creates the people, he creates his people for blessing, meaning we are created for mission, the mission of being a blessing. This is the very reason we exist. And so when we try to evangelize or share the faith, and we make it all about your life is hard, things have not gone your way, come to Jesus and he will fix things. I mean, that's kind of the modern kind of therapeutic Jesus, but what it does is it makes the faith about us. And really, it's not about us. It's about the world. And God will choose us and save us and sanctify us and work with us, not for our sake, but for the sake of the world and for the sake of his name. And of course, Jesus is the prime example of this, right? He comes to give his life for the world, not just to help everybody feel better. He doesn't heal everybody. He doesn't remove the Roman authorities, and he doesn't somehow eliminate all the corruption going on in first century Palestine. I mean, those are important things, but ultimately he gives his life to the world and for the world. The spiritual blessing, and which goes back to Genesis chapter 2, the Sabbath. And as I mentioned, everyone will begin to recognize the hand of God. And I give you some examples there where they will say, we see the blessing of Yahweh. And so I give you several examples. What time is it? Let me keep going. And then the physical blessing. So I've already touched on these things, but hopefully having it on the screen there will be helpful. But what I've been trying to communicate is our ethics is all of this. Ethics is missional, ethics is physical, material, and ethics is spiritual. Ethics is individual, ethics is corporate. Ethics is systemic and social, inevitably so, because of the nature of human existence. And so what we find in the book of Genesis then is the pilgrimage of faith and mission, and all the patriarchs fail, even as they have their high points. And this is going to be the story of the people of God, high points and low points as we grow in faith and walk in pilgrimage, basically, with him. Okay, so jumping ahead to the law, what we need to understand when we get to Old Testament law, and many evangelicals don't really understand law, the first thing is to understand what any law does. And this goes for ancient law as well as modern law in any country in the world. Law organizes society. Law orders society. It defines how we act with one another. It controls exchange, economic exchange. That's an ancient idea. What we do with property, what we do with when people die, what we do when people rob, when people kill, when people rape, all these things you find in law codes around the world and throughout history. What law is trying to do is organize human existence and keep us from destroying each other, which we're very good at. Somehow giving a semblance of order. And even the most violent society, like, for instance, I was just reading today about what Russia has become since the Ukrainian war. It's become a militarized state. And so the control of the media, the control of dissent, now part of education, even of children, is military. And so what you're seeing is the militarization and the Stalinization of Russia. But what you're seeing is it's actually ordering, in perverse ways, the country. See? The laws that are being put into place, the prisons that are functioning, are all adding order. So the question is it a good law? Okay. But the fact is that every law or every country in the world has law that is trying to organize it and control it in some kind of way and to help it function, whether it's traffic laws, whether it's property law, whether it's marital law, all these different kinds of things. All countries in the history of the world have done this. So if we begin to realize then that when we get into the Old Testament and then we turn the page from Genesis into Exodus, and we begin to see the giving of the law, we have to put it into its context. Now, if you look at the narrative of Genesis, Exodus, at the end of the book of Genesis, they're in Egypt. Egypt functions. Egypt has laws. Egypt has an army. Egypt has a pharaoh. Egypt has priests. Egypt has a way of controlling the economy. Egypt has all kinds of social structures that are functioning. And in the function of ancient Egypt, you also have values of what people are worth, the social stratification, whether that is in terms of economics, or politics, or their religion, all the social stratification that goes on in Egypt. It is a matrix that their law had created. So when God takes them out of Egypt, he takes them into the middle of nowhere in the desert, and he gives them another law. What he does is he gives them a blueprint for an alternative way of structuring society that is not like it had been in Egypt. This is why he'll say things, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. And the question will be, will we treat foreigners as we were treated as foreigners in Egypt? Will we treat our poor people as poor people were treated in Egypt? Will women have a certain kind of role among us, unlike what they had in Egypt? Will we have a pharaoh or will we not? All these things have to be understood contextually in the narrative as difference. This is an alternative thing. But what I call here enduring is, even though it's very contextual for an ancient time, there are enduring lessons for us. We cannot replicate ancient Israelite law. That was for a peasant economy, 1000 BC or more. Okay? We live in the 21st century in a technological age. It would be silly to try to imitate Old Testament law. But Old Testament law, if it reflects the heart of God, will have certain basic values and commitments that we can now carry over and structure in our own world and try to reflect as best we can what God would have wanted back then. So the foundations of law in the ancient world of Israel, and this is going to be important to help us understand how even the law is fundamentally ethical. In Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 to 25, God hears their groaning and their crying out. He sees their affliction and he acts. the very fact that he does this law, that he creates this legislation, is a response to their suffering. So at the very heart of the law and the giving of the law is the ethical impulse of God himself, of compassion and of justice. And the other passages that I mentioned there are is when God will hear and see the suffering of others. In Genesis 4, for instance, it's the blood of Abel that's crying out. In chapter 18, he sees the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah that's coming up to him. So God responds, and he responds by giving them a different law. And so the law is foundationally ethical. In Exodus 19, he says, I'm choosing you to be a nation of priests. They are to be the mediators, a special possession in the sight of God in the world, and as a nation of priests to communicate the values he has for them to the rest of the world. And what you're hearing is an echo of Genesis 12 about being a blessing. And then in Deuteronomy 4, verses 8 to 10, the idea, he says in Deuteronomy, is that all the nations of the world around you will look at your laws and they will say, what other nation has such wise laws? And what other nation has their God so close to them? So even the law of Israel becomes a testament to the world because it will create a different kind of society. Now, the society is fundamentally religious. So there's all kinds of sacrifices and feasts. But this is an ancient society, so it's going to be fundamentally religious anyway. Ours is not. Ours is fundamentally a secular society. So for us, this seems kind of extreme, but it would not have been in the ancient world. And here's the thing, too, and Mary, you asked me about culture. If we can think of the law as part of the culture of ancient Israel, and the fact that they had certain national feasts, and the feasts were to remember their history. The Sabbath, to remember the creation and the rhythms of creation. The Passover, to remember the deliverance from slavery. You have first fruits and the Feast of Weeks, where you're celebrating the provision of God. And they do this as a people. And as they celebrate these feasts, they recount their history. So what you begin to see is the national ceremonies that are geared to create and sustain and to develop their national identity. But the identity itself and their history is grounded in the ethics of God and his ethical demands. So, we talk about patriotism and things like this. If we look at it from the Old Testament side, it is functioning in a transformative sense as national moments together to remember the grace of God and the deliverance of God.
I think to me, I think of Thanksgiving, not necessarily the holiday, although also the holiday, but that it's about Thanksgiving and knowing where your blessings come from, right? And remembering that and recounting that we were slaves in Egypt and God freed us, and apply that to any number of contexts here in our own country, and how God has blessed us in multiple ways. But I think the danger is when we start to think that we are the ones who've achieved the blessings, and we are the ones who've have provided for ourselves and made ourselves strong and safe and things. And then that's when you start to get in trouble, which also goes back to the themes you were talking about before about abiding with God, right? And how when we started to move away from him in the garden and move away from him at the Tower of Babel, then that's when he got upset and wanted us to come back and stay with him and remember him and not drift away.
Yeah, and the thing that we need to be very honest about is that this country, in a sense, and this is true, every country in the world has a very dark side. What we did to the Native Americans, as we moved west, um, the bringing of slaves by the hundreds of thousands, and that very dark part of history, and a history that still is marked by racism and prejudice. And when people now are trying to remember those things, some people don't want us to remember those things, or they want us to remember them in a different kind of way. Now, what you see, you get in the African American community, you get Juneteenth. So you're going back to the declaration of the end of slavery, and Cinco de Mayo, which is a Mexican kind of holiday. If you think about Holocaust Remembrance Day for the Jews, the idea is you can't forget. You can't forget not only the blessings of God, but you can't forget the darkness. And that's part of the temptation of certain kinds of patriotism, where it whitewashes history. The challenge is, how do we remember rightly and constructively? That becomes the challenge. What we're seeing in this country is people are criticizing the memories, which they should, but sometimes it's not a constructive exercise.
Would that be akin to where I'm just thinking about how Jesus had grief with the scribes and the Pharisees who did their festivals, but the spirit of the why was lost, and so he'd say things like, "Do what they say, but don't do what they do." Because they had forgotten the reason why they were even celebrating it, perhaps, or as the scripture is fond to say, "Remember, you were slaves in Egypt."
Yeah.
How you treat foreigners, and like I think so. When I think of that, like editing history, I'm just wondering if that is kind of one of the ways that we could see that.
Yeah, and again, every country does this. I mean, every country
Mhm.
watches its history. Every country idealizes its past. Every country with its founding fathers, they're always righteous people and hardworking and honest. I mean, um, every country in the world does this. I mean, because
Yeah.
we want to remember a certain kind of way. But what happens is that a country has different populations, like this one, and so people are going, that's really a truncated memory.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, yeah,
That's not how I remember it, or that's not how my ancestors remember it, or
yeah. Or if we, any minority group. I mean, look at the history of Asians in this country, and it's heartbreaking.
right,
Going back to the Chinese and in the
internment camps. Yeah.
and Latinos, and I mean, it's just over and over and over again. I mean, humans being human. And,
Hmm.
yeah. So, but you can see the importance of memory for ethics, because if you remember rightly, you will do rightly. If you remember poorly, or
Hmm.
if you remember selectively, then that'll have repercussions. I mean, so there's a reason why God says, don't ever forget.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, people don't want to remember the slavery. People don't want to remember our history of immigration in this country. People don't want to remember this and that, you see. The removal of the indigenous people from their lands and, taken across country and put on reservations and get them out of sight and out of the way. I mean, we don't want to remember those things, you see. But if we don't remember, we just repeat the same.
There it is. Yeah.
I mean, the color of the skin might change, but it's the recurring pattern is what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay, the thing that I wanted to mention here about the law, and it's already at 5 after 8, but what you have in the law, again, tying it to ethics, is what is called the quadrilateral of the vulnerable. So you have all kinds of legislation about poor people, about widows and orphans, and about foreigners. Now, a couple of comments about this. If you go to other ancient law codes, they have legislation for the poor. Okay, so Israel is not unique in having legislation for the poor. What is unique is the amount of legislation. And what is unique is the motivation for the legislation. Because they have been experiencing the blessing of God, they are to be gracious and hospitable, and they are to be generous. See? So the motivation of reaching out to the poor is because God reached out to them in their need, and now they, in their abundance, and they are to set aside, parts of the harvest and to take a special tithe every 3 years. All this kind of effort, but it's grounded in the person of God and their history. The same with the widows and orphans, you see. The motivation behind this is grounded ultimately in God and in their history with him. And the foreigner, you will not find in any ancient law code anything close to what the Old Testament has for the foreigner. And he says, once you were foreigners in Egypt. Again, it's grounded in their history, but it's grounded also in the person of God. If anyone's writing down any notes, if you look in Deuteronomy chapter 10, I think beginning around verse 10 or 12 and go to the end of the chapter, he'll talk about how God cares for all these different kind of people. And he will actually say, you will love the foreigner because I do. So what you're seeing, again, is the grounding of this concern, the social concern in their history and in the person of God. And again, what I've said several times already is ethics is at the core of what it means to be the people of God, and it is legislated. And the motivation behind it is history and the person of God. And many times there is no sanction. So when you look at laws about taking care of the foreigner, it doesn't say, if you don't do this, this is what will happen to you. It's not sanctioned, meaning he's appealing not to penalties to force them to do this. He's appealing to their conscience and to their history. And what you find, and this is important too, is that the care of these vulnerable people reflects on their identity as the people of God. In God's mind, you cannot ignore these people and still claim to be followers of God. This is the proof of their identity. And of course, this is what you'd find in the New Testament and with Jesus as well. So as I mentioned, there are other similarities with other law codes, but the differences are in their history and in the relationship with God. And the idea, again, is to create a different and alternative kind of culture. So if we were to bring this over into the New Testament, the question is, how is the church an alternative culture to the culture around it? Is the culture of the church being identified by the surrounding culture by these ways of how we deal with the quadrilateral of the vulnerable, or even more now, if we had drug addiction and things like this. So what we're finding is that this is the identity marker of the people of God then and now as they create a different culture. And this is what we should be thinking about today. And again, what you're seeing is our identity marker is our ethics. Okay, I really need to move kind of quickly here. Let me see what I want to do here. Okay, I'm going to put it all up and go rather quickly. How's that? What you find as you move throughout the narrative in the Old Testament, as you move from kind of nomads and they form tribes and things like this, clans, is that they need some kind of centralized government. So in Judges, you'll find in those days, everyone did what was right in their own eyes because there was no king in Israel. Okay, so it's telling you, okay, what we need is some kind of king. Now, in the ancient world, and you see this in 1 Samuel 8, the beginning of 1 Samuel 8. In the ancient world, kings had two primary responsibilities. One was to bring justice, and the other one was to lead them into war and to protect them. So if you go to 1 Samuel 8, when they ask Samuel for a king, this is what they're asking for. They're asking for justice because his sons are corrupt. They want a good judge. And later on in the chapter, it talks about we need a king who will lead us into battle. So what you're seeing, again, the ancient world, what we see today, right? We want justice and we want protection. This is what humans want. And so in the ancient world, this was the duty of the king. But you also find a series of warnings. In Deuteronomy 17, it says several things. I'll just highlight a couple of them. One is that the king should have a copy of the law and read it every day. And here's the clincher, so that he will not think of himself as better than anybody else. Well, that'd be a great lesson for politicians today, wouldn't it be? But if you think that Deuteronomy is playing off of Egypt and Pharaoh, you can see how profound that verse is. So that he will not think of himself as better than anybody else. In Egypt, Pharaoh was God. So what you find very early on is the idea of a different kind of politics. And then it also says about the king not to multiply wives, not to multiply wealth, and not to multiply horses, which would be chariots, army. Those are the three markers of great kings in the ancient world. A harem, lots of women, wealthy, and armies. Those are the three markers of great kings. And what God is doing is he's subverting all of that. And he's saying, kings under my rule will have none of that and none of the arrogance of Pharaoh as well. And in 1 Samuel 8, what he does too, he warns them. He says, there's a verb, if you look at the passage, beginning about verse 10, I think. But what he'll say is the king will take. He'll take your young men and put them into his armies. He'll take your daughters and put them into the service of the palace. He'll take 10% of what you own. He'll take your property. All these things he will take for his own good and for those who are with him. So what you begin to understand in the Bible is that, again, think about ethics. Politics is about power and money. It's about wealth. And what we're seeing is God is subverting all of that. And if we can begin to appreciate that politics oftentimes is the politics of taking by those in power, what you begin to see is a realistic view of human politics. It's cruel, it's selfish, it's power grabbing. This is what human government is like, which is a warning for us, for those who would want to get involved in government. What makes it worse is that what you find is that religion is co-opted by the government, and now God is seen at the service of the king, at the service of his foreign policy, at the service of his economic policies. And we see it in this country, where the idea of God and the government going hand in hand, or God with the national leader going hand in hand. And the danger throughout human history is the danger of religion being co-opted by politics. It's not unique to Christians, and Christians have done this for 2,000 years. You can go to India today and see the rise of militant Hinduism. You go to certain strands of Islam, and what you're seeing is the co-optation of Islam by politics and armies and invasions and things like this. Humans will use their religion for power and politics. And the danger of the Christian church, and we've done it for 2,000 years, is to fall into the same trap. And this is why we have a different king, we have a different citizenship, and our hope is not in the government, but our hope is the coming of Messiah, who will be a different kind of king. Okay, so about 5 more minutes, and then any questions, and then we're good to go. I've been moving very quickly. There's so much to cover, so much good stuff in the Old Testament. So we ended one of our times together with Micah, and so I thought I would just highlight some things with Micah. And if anyone is taking any notes, and if you don't have this slide now or from a previous time, I'd want you to look at these verses. In chapter 2 of Micah, the powerful will scheme in their beds to take land from vulnerable people. And then there's this great line, sadly. It says, because it is in their power to do so. So we find is the powerful taking advantage of vulnerable people, even in ancient Israel. This is what we see, and this is what the prophets will denounce. The false views of God and his world. He says, if a prophet were to come and prophesy good things and beer for everybody, everyone would love it. Okay? What we want is someone to tell us good things and happy things, not to confront us with our sin. In chapter 3, verses 1 to 7 and 9 to 12, it talks about the cruelty of the powerful, and it talks about them taking the flesh off the bones of the poor and throwing those bones into a pot. And unlike them, in chapter 3, verse 8, Micah says that he has the power of God to proclaim his justice. And in verses 9 and 12, this corruption and this cruelty will extend even to the prophets and to the priests. And in chapter 5 to 12, 5:12 to 14, and 6:1 to 8, we've talked about this before. What we find very quickly, I'll say this because this is a real popular kind of justice kind of verse. Micah 6:8, what does God require? To love justice and to walk humbly and to, what's the third one?
Love mercy.
Love mercy. Okay, thank you. And we totally take it out of context. If you begin with verse 1 of chapter 6, God is angry. He's bringing a lawsuit against his people because they have turned his back on them. And so what you get in verse 6 is this question, with what shall I come before the Lord? In the ancient world, what they're saying is this, our God is angry. What can I bring to appease the God? And so, shall I bring, these offerings? Shall I bring, a calf a year old? That's prime beef. Boy, that'd be a great offering. The answer is yes. Would God want that? Yes. Would God want 10,000 barrels of oil? The answer would be yes. Of course, God would want that. Now, as Protestant, Christians, our answer to the question is no, God doesn't want that. Well, you're not an ancient person. In their minds, God would have said yes in their mind. And then finally he says, shall I bring my firstborn for sacrifice?
Yeah.
And then you go, oh, maybe not. And then he says, let me tell you what God wants. But here's the point. We tend to sit on verse 8, but if you put it in context, the most important idea to take away is how twisted their view of God was, that they thought they could buy him off. They thought that they could appease him. And what he's telling them is that he wants an ethical people. But the takeaway is how twisted their view of God was. Did they have sacrifices? Yes. If you were to ask, the roving reporter on the streets of Jerusalem those days, and you've asked, do you believe in Yahweh? The answer would have been yes. Do you follow God? The answer would have been yes. But it is totally twisted their view of God. It's like if you walk into a church today and ask someone in the pew, do you believe in God? What are they going to say? Well, yes, that's why I'm here. But the question is, what is their God like? Is their God the God of the scriptures? Now you're in a different discussion. The very fact that churches are not interested in ethics is telling us that they are worshiping a God who has the name of our God, but their concept of God is very different. And that's why all of this needs to begin not on the street, though it needs to get there, obviously. It needs to begin in the church itself. Once we begin to get the church understanding God and what he wants, now ethics become a natural outflow. And then the end of Micah, the longing for a different future, what he does not talk about, other prophets like Isaiah talk more about it, is Messiah. But the idea that the hope is a different kind of time, a different kind of leader, and a different kind of ethos, and a different kind of worship, because the king would have come. Okay, wow, we've got like 5 or 6 minutes. So I've gone like warp speed, real fast, 30,000 feet. So I don't know if there's any questions or complaints. If there are any complaints, talk to Herb.
Exactly, bring them. Hey, I've got a question.
Okay.
I've heard in my evangelical circles that what was expected of the people of God was actually impossible for them to do. And so then it kind of pushes back against this, like, well, God had these expectations, but the people weren't capable of filling that out. And so then we have like this insert the Holy Spirit that now gives us the ability to now do the things that God has called us to do. How does that square with what we're talking about?
I'd say yes and no. I mean, there are verses in the Old Testament and Deuteronomy that says he is not giving you a law that's impossible for you to do. Okay. On the other hand, it is impossible for them. It's even impossible for us.
Right.
And we have the Spirit. I mean, so we have all these advantages that they didn't have. We have the fullness of the scriptures they didn't have. They didn't know about Jesus. He hadn't come yet. I mean, they knew about Messiah, maybe.
Yeah.
But he had not actually come for them to kind of have a model. It was still very kind of vague. So I would say yes and no. In one sense, because we have the Spirit and because we have 2,000 years of church history and because we have 1,000 years of Old Testament history, in one sense, we're beyond excuse.
Right.
We have all kinds of advantages they didn't have, and we still don't do it. Yeah, some people will say that to say things like, "Oh, the Old Testament was a time of law, but we're in the time of grace," things like that.
Right. Yeah.
But that's very simplistic, and it's very common, but I don't think it works very well.
Okay. Thank you. Mary, are there other questions?
Well, I just keep getting stuck. You've said the word ethics multiple times.
Yes.
And that's not a word that we see much in scripture. So how do you define that scripturally?
Well, I would say one thing, just because it doesn't appear in scripture doesn't mean it's not a scriptural idea. It's like saying, well,
Right, but yeah,
yeah,
how
the word Trinity doesn't appear either. I mean, um, to me, ethics is right living and right
Mhm.
thinking, and right being defined by the word of God. So even if there's in the modern world where we won't find laws in the Old Testament about modern things like nuclear war, something like that. Um, the ethical thing is to ground how we perceive those things in the values in the revelation of God. So I think ethics is the idea of doing and thinking rightly, both individually and corporately, as those who claim to follow God.
Mhm.
Ideally, it would be incarnate in the church, and part of our ethical commitment, I would think, is to see how we might communicate that in the broader society. That becomes the challenge, especially if they don't have the same motivations, the
Right.
same that we do. So then the question is, how do Christians relate to the state?
Mhm.
We talked about that one Monday night.
Mhm.
Well, it depends. You've got the Reformed view and the Anabaptist view and the Catholic view. I mean, so Christians have tried to answer that question. How do you take the ethics of the people of God and relate it to the state,
Mhm.
to society? And Christians there's a whole spectrum of views on that.
Mm.
But that's how I would see ethics, Mary.
Mhm.
Yeah, good question.
It's helpful.
Yeah.
Well, we've got time for one more question. I like to say that because it feels like I'm like a show host or something,
Good. Sounded official.
doesn't it?
I liked it. Yep.
Well, this has been the probably the most challenging and the most exciting Bible study that I've been a part of in years. I only wish that it were more frequent.
Mm.
Perhaps I'll need to take a class online or something, and that way I could just hang out with you and go through this again. Um, do you have any suggested readings or anything that would be beneficial to the people? Anglicans we'd love to have our books.
I can give you the name of a big book. It's not that recent, but it's wonderfully written by an Anglican, actually,
Oh,
Church of England guy, I think. Um, there's a missiologist slash theologian slash Old Testament scholar called Christopher Wright,
Mm.
and two big books. And he writes very well, and they're not hard to read, but don't let the size deter you. But one is called Old Testament Ethics for the People of God. Old Testament Ethics for the People of God. And the other one that came about 2 years later is called The Mission of God.
Mm.
Because I know him as Chris. Chris began his career as a missionary in India. Um, and that got him interested in ethics because, I mean, there you are in India, right?
right.
And but what he began to see, and he's so right in this, is that once you begin to talk about ethics, it's inescapable that you're going to talk about the mission of God.
Mm.
You can't separate social ethics, if you're a Christian, from the mission of the people of God. I mean, they go hand in hand. And so he moved actually from focusing on Old Testament ethics, moved into more missiology,
Hmm.
uh, and does a wonderful way of bringing those all together. But those two books, they're older now. The first one is 2004, the second one is 2006, but they're still excellent. I mean, he's written other things since then that play off of those books.
Okay.
But those would be two books that I would just recommend to any believer that just wants to kind of talk through things. And it's kind of written for educated lay people. Um, Hardly any footnotes at all. He writes extremely well, and understandably, he organizes things very well. They're easy to read, but they're profound.
Awesome.
Yeah, and he has the life and the career to back it up.
Hmm.
And then the book that Christine was kind of advertising for me is that book that I published a year ago called The Lord Roars.
Mm-hmm.
That focuses on the prophets. Chris Wright's books will focus more on the Pentateuch and the law and the narratives. He also will spend a good time in the wisdom literature. My book focuses more on the prophets, and so that might be something. And it's maybe 120 pages.
Hmm.
Chris's are like 500, 450 or something.
Holy moly.
Yeah, but like I said, don't be scared with the size.
You say that.
In the prints, it's not fine print either. I mean, so
okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to, Mary, unless you want to pray, I definitely want to pray for your travels, and pray for all those who've been in the group, who've been with us.
Please do.
All right.
It'd be great.
Father God, thank you that we've heard this language that you are the same yesterday, today, and forever. And just getting a glimpse of an understanding of your idea of ethics from the Old Testament and how you have been consistent for those people, and you are the same God today for us, and you call us to follow you and to do it for you, Lord. I pray for those who've listened today that they would be challenged and changed, prodded to produce fruit and fruit that will last. I pray for Danny as he travels, he and his wife travel back home, Lord, that their time would also be fruitful, would be refreshing, and that they would be inspired to love and to continue to challenge and equip the saints for the work of the ministry. I pray this in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Yeah, it's been great to be with you.
Likewise, if you get a wild hair and you want to do this again in the fall, I just want you to know that we would be grateful. That's all I'm saying. That was my gentle plug.
No pressure. No pressure.
None.
Laura Christelle's nodding. Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks for everybody. It's a time of year where people are busy with graduations and end of the year stuff, at least on my kind of work. Yeah. All right. Well, you know where to find me.